Even in a room full of anarchists, there is an unspoken social value on conformity, on appeasing somebody else's agenda, going along with somebody else's plan. Some of that is the natural drive for the security and social validation and acceptance. And some of that is conditioned. So, we all know in this room that a stateless society would have substantially less to be scared of, right? We can use things like history and economics / praxeology, just general reason, to pretty conclusively find that a world without government would most likely be more peaceful, more prosperous. There'd be less danger, right? We know government is the most violent and destructive institution in human history by a pretty massive margin. We know governments killed 250 million of their own people alone just in the last century, not including acts of war, right? So we know all this consciously. However, if you saw headlines right now saying all governments have suddenly collapsed, big part of you would be like, woohoo! But most likely there is some small part deep down that would be like, what happens now? That's okay. That doesn't make you any less of an anarchist. It means you're human and conditioned. By the way, if you don't think that applies to you, I actually polled anarcho-capitalists. About 85.5% admitted that what I just said applies to them personally. And that's just the ones that admitted it. So, despite knowing that we'd be better off, we're still scared of getting what we want to some degree. And some of it is that we fear change, right? Change is risk, and our minds are geared towards risk aversion above all else, or above most else. And again, some of it is conditioned. When you first come into the world, you are entirely dependent on others for security. I'm not letting some cat out of the bag. Babies, when it comes to things like self-sufficiency and survival, independence, they are useless with that stuff. It's okay, that's supposed to be. So babies then rely entirely on those who are raising them to provide them with security. Of course, that's security from external dangers, people and animals that might want to harm them. Security in the form of like sustenance, nourishment, having what you're going to need. And security from themselves to an extent. Babies, like if left unattended, they will put stuff in their mouths that they would choke on, screw around with electrical outlets, try to crawl off of high places, right? So they need parents to, pull them away from the high place or, stop the harm from happening. Now, babies and small children recognize inherently that their parents are their figures of security. That's instinctive. By the way, when I say parents, if you were like raised by, like an uncle or grandma or whatever, just plug them in. All right. So parents to a small child, they represent security. They are the figures of security. We can actually observe, like a small child or a baby will actually, if the mother walks away or something, the baby will start to cry. They lose that sense of security often when they don't have that attention and protection at the time from their parents. A baby will cry sometimes just because the mother's not holding the baby. So security, our foundation of security, it underlies all of how we think and feel, right? As adults, throughout our entire lives, everything we think and feel and believe, it relies on our sense of security. And an easy way to observe this is watch what statists do, right? Statists, many of which consider themselves champions of liberty, right? Even statists who consider themselves freedom-oriented will often, if a politician comes along and says, hey, look at this scary thing, it's gun owners or Mexicans or Muslims or the rich or whatever, right? They'll come along and say, look at these scary things, only giving me more power can protect you from that. Now, clearly giving politicians power has been one of the most dangerous things people have ever done, but that foundation, that need for that security is so strong that people will get scared irrationally and create worse of a problem with the scarier thing that poses a larger danger, because they desperately want to have that sense of security, and they feel they've been manipulated into feeling that that politician can provide that. So how we perceive security and how we experience that sense of security, it comes largely from how we interact with our parents as small children. You know, when you are a small child, they call it the formative years, right? That's when the foundation of how your mind will work, the framework of your brain for the rest of your life is being set. So parents then represent security and determine how the child will think for the rest of their lives in terms of security. And it's not just that, it's also social interaction. You know, as small children, we learn how people should interact with each other and how to be in the social world by interacting with and observing those who are directly around us and those who are raising us, especially the figures of security. Now, one thing that actually stems from social validation and social acceptance is, believe it or not, the conscience. The reason we have a conscience, the reason we have an emotional aversion to doing things that are perceived as bad and a desire to do things that are perceived as good, at least most of us do, is because evolutionarily, you do better, you're more likely to survive and reproduce for longer if people like you. We're a social species, and we fare a hell of a lot better when we have things like trade and support networks of sorts. So we've evolved then to have this conscience, and that's formed based on our experiences also as small children, what others perceive and demonstrate perceiving as good and bad. So parents then, to a small child, represent not only security and not only social validation, but also morality. Now, I'm not a moral relativist. That's a totally different conversation. But it does vary as far as conscience goes, emotional morality. That varies from culture to culture, right? You know, in some cultures, people will actually feel emotionally guilty if they don't pledge to a flag, you know, or do some other weird cult thing. Whereas others, you know, just don't care. So parents then determine how a child will think about all of these things during their early years. Now, I have recently become a parent myself, and I have found that often I have to protect my child from himself, like I mentioned earlier. You know, you got to pull the baby off of the high ledge or whatever. Just because they don't know better. You know, you're not, that's not really like authoritarian or whatever. It's not like the kid has some active will to, you know, jump off of something. They just don't understand. It's like pushing someone out of the way of a bus that they don't know is there. Now, we instinctively want to protect our children. It's a really strong drive, I think the strongest. So what that often manifests as is a desire, through the desire to protect our children, we have a desire to have as much influence as we possibly can. I mean, kind of logically, if you want to protect something, you have the ability to do that more if you have more influence. And you have the most influence by having control in some form. Now, what this turns into, whether intentionally or kind of inadvertently, it's heavily backed up by cultural phenomena that have existed for thousands of years. It often becomes a kind of formalized hierarchy, right? Where small children, from the time they are babies, often literally infants, are taught very explicitly and overtly that if you do as you are told, you should be commended, you are good, that you owe this obedience. And if you disobey, then something is wrong with you, you are wicked in some form, and you deserve to be punished. Parents, when they do this, they make themselves into figures of authority. Now, children already see their parents as the figures of security, the figures of social interaction, at least the introduction to it, and the figures of morality. So what happens then when a parent creates this hierarchical dynamic where the child must submit, they must surrender their agency to their parent and accept being punished for doing things that are, you know, just their own desires, or, you know, they get rewarded for doing what they're told, punished for doing what they're not. It kind of teaches them to seek approval, but at the same time what it's doing, it takes that figure of security and makes them into a figure of authority. And so in doing so, you are creating a deeply held emotional conflation between security and authority. And at the very same time, You're creating an emotional conflation between social interaction and cooperation and authority. And also at the same time, you're creating that very same conflation, but between morality and authority. So what is the result of this? We can observe what I just said. Go tell a statist that you want to get rid of all government, you want to have no authority in society. What do half of them say right off the bat? Things along the lines of, there would be no security, no morality, no social cooperation. We would all just run around and murder everybody and just rape and pillage. There could be no security, there could be no morality because there's no authority. Now that's not rational, right? I mean, it only takes a few minutes of thought about, just kind of how markets work and why do things that we like get provided to us for the most part, to find that that's not how it would be. But they have been trained very, very effectively from the time they were this big, from the time their entire outlook on life has been forming. They have been taught that security equals authority, morality equals authority, social cooperation equals authority. Therefore, in the absence of security, there could be none of them. So what do we do about it? It is theoretically possible. I know that some will disagree. It is theoretically possible, in my opinion, for the state to collapse and even be kept away without having first an anarchist majority. It is possible. There's a couple ways it could maybe happen. There could be a fiat currency collapse, be it through hyperinflation or whatever, and maybe that leads to everyone using crypto and people find, it's easy to not pay taxes. Even most statists who support taxation would rather not pay taxes themselves, right? Like Republicans want tax cuts across the board, and Democrats want tax cuts for themselves and just make the rich pay more. Very seldom does somebody say, I want to pay more taxes. You never see somebody write a check to the IRS for 1 penny more than what the IRS insists they are owed, or for what they calculate that the IRS would insist. So even most statists would avoid paying if they safely could. And when you get into using crypto, you find, it's kind of safe and convenient to just not tell them about it and just not pay them. So that is one way, if cryptocurrency replaced fiat currency, it is entirely plausible to me that it would become utterly impossible to enforce taxes. There are a couple other methods. I think Jim Bell was here the last time I was here, and he was talking about prediction markets, right? Essentially, it's an anonymous online prediction market where people are betting on events happening, and it would be presented as I'll bet on who's going to win the Super Bowl or whatever. But quickly that becomes essentially, say 10 million Mexicans each put up $1 betting that Donald Trump doesn't get assassinated, and then one person comes in and says, I bet he will, and I bet it'll be on a Tuesday with a 30-06 or something. That person then takes $10 million home. And so the conclusion of this is that you would have the Republicans would kill off the Democrat politicians, and the Democrats would kill off the Republican politicians. It would be kind of impossible to rule without getting shot. Eventually, by your own bodyguard, if your bounty is big enough. Personally, that's not my favorite option, by the way. I tend to think that would also evolve into, or I guess devolve into, celebrities getting shot and stuff. I could see Justin Bieber or whatever having a tag on him. That's not. It's not good. So it is plausible that the state could be crushed while most people still support it, be it tax evasion, be it collectively crowdfunding assassinations or whatever. However, I think most of us would agree it will be a lot smoother of a transition and a lot better if people no longer see authority as being their entirety of their source of morality, security, and social cooperation. So then how do we get around that hump? That's a really massive hump. I mean, that conflation in their minds right there, that is how you get a completely normal person, an otherwise normal person who is peaceful and rational for the most part, who then is willing to, be a Nazi or a Soviet or whatever, who's willing to murder and cage peaceful people. All of the horrible things that we turn on the news and we open history books and see have been carried out by regular Joes for the most part. There's just not that many, overt sociopaths and psychopaths to comprise, armies of millions of people and giant law enforcement bodies. So they got to get regular people to do their bidding. And foundational to that is having this conflation that I just described, having that paradigm where children learn that authority is their means of security, social cooperation, and morality. So when you tell an adult who's otherwise peaceful and rational that they need to go do this horrible thing that they would never on their own do, they'll do it if they see doing it as being a function of security, social cooperation, and morality, aka if it's coming from authority. So in order to get around that, in order to get people to make that separation, in my observation, you have to show them that the preconception is wrong without attacking it. For example, when you start telling when you walk up to a statist and suggest getting rid of authority, you can kind of gauge which of the conflations is most prominent in them. And different statists have different mindsets behind it. Like some might be scared that it would be some giant free-for-all where nobody cooperates. Every man for himself. How many statists have used that term when talking to an anarchist? It'd be every man for himself, because they see authority as being the manifestation of social cooperation, right? So then go from that angle. If it's that kind of person, then show them that authority is the antithesis of social cooperation. That social cooperation is essentially, it's peaceful. It's people associating peacefully and voluntarily, engaging in things like friendship and trade. That is the opposite of government. Government is, give me your money and do what I say or I'll hurt you. That is not social cooperation in any meaningful sense. It's certainly not the kind of social cooperation which has got our species so advanced. So show them that. Show them that that is not social cooperation, that that's not what social cooperation is all about. And when you put things in literal terms, when you get statists to describe literally what they're talking about and what you're talking about, it kind of becomes really obvious, and they have no choice but to kind of take a step back and walk a little bit away from their preconceptions when you get them to start saying there could be no social cooperation without guys with guns forcing everybody to be part of this weird thing. And then do the same thing with security. That's probably the easiest one. Because, we have the data to show there is no greater threat to your security than the state. I actually figured this out a few weeks back. So people talk about how the police are our protection from all the private criminals and stuff. So in the United States anyway, and this is based on FBI statistics, you are 8 times more likely to be in some way violently encroached on, and that would include arrest for a victimless crime, 8 times more likely to be victimized by the police than by any private criminal. And we have data to show these things. We have the body counts of all these governments, including our own. So you have to just separate it in the statist's mind. Show that they're not the same thing. And by the way, that usually doesn't happen overnight, right? A lot of people are percolators in their heads, and they need some time to kind of figure things out and sort things out. And kind of probably the easiest one is the morality angle. Pretty much every statist has a moral framework for the most part. There's plenty of crazies, fascists and tankies and whatnot they openly consider it immoral to not be a slave to the proletariat dictatorship or to in any way disobey and shoot anybody who litters or whatever. But for the most part, most systems of morality in humanity, they kind of revolve around the non-aggression principle already, because that's what makes the society work. Generally, is that you can't steal, you can't murder, you can't rape. That in the resolution of disputes, the code that they are resolved with, it pretty much across the board, for the most part, revolves around property rights and the non-aggression principle. They just, for the most part, make a huge exception for this one gang, for the state. But when you describe the state as it is literally, it is an organization of people who, unlike anybody else, is endowed with the perceived right to initiate force against everyone, to make you do whatever it says. There's hundreds of thousands of arbitrary made-up edicts pertaining to every aspect of our waking lives, in every part of commerce. And they will initiate violence against you up to the point of killing you, because if you flat out, all the way won't cooperate with the state, the logical conclusion to that every single time is you die. There is no way around that. Unless they don't find you, either you will at some point comply, whether it's directly with the IRS or it's with the enforcers that come. If you all the way will not obey them at some point, then they kill you. And this is kind of logically unavoidable. And statists will wiggle to try to avoid that fact that the nature of the relationship between citizen and state, it is one of forced subservience based on death threats. And when you get them to acknowledge that, you can separate security and morality from authority in their minds. And you do it persistently and you keep reinforcing it, especially if you have continual relationships, like where it's not just somebody that you come across on the street and never see again. It's definitely good to plant those seeds. I do it like habitually. On the way over here at the airport in Mexico City, I was kind of converting these two old British ladies, asking where I'm going to, and I got to use that as an opportunity. Oh, what is voluntarism? So, if we managed to do this on a scale large enough, if we managed to take away the cohesion of authority and morality, social cooperation, and security, if we could separate those things in enough minds, then that transition into liberty, whatever form it takes, be it a currency revolution of sorts, be it a full-blown old-school revolution, I don't think that's likely, but whatever form it takes, it's going to be a lot smoother, especially not just getting there, but the aftermath. Because if the state fell right now, there's a few things that happen. I think very quickly, probably within a few weeks or maybe a couple of months, the private sector would really amplify its offering of security and stuff to fill the gaps that the state had been monopolizing, right? But that's probably not overnight. It kind of depends on, do we know the government's about to collapse? Can the market prepare for it and stuff? If it just collapsed today, there would be a little bit of time before the market can have established itself to step in right away. Unfortunately, that's just how it is. There could potentially, depending on how it went, there could be a couple of days where statists who had previously seen authority as the source of morality, now not having authority, might kind of lose their sense of, now I have to do right. It's plausible. You could have some people that are acting like animals and going out and attacking people like it's the purge, because that's what they think anarchy is. And then I think very quickly they'd find, people don't put up with that. And people have guns like freely now. And then after not long, the market steps in and you've got kind of more formalized security infrastructure and whatnot to make sure that all the places people want to attract consumers, be it roads or housing developments or stores, pretty much wherever people are found, it's profitable for them to feel safe, right? So, they would step in. But I think we all want as peaceful and orderly a transition as we can get, probably for the most part. And this is facilitated most effectively when you take away that conflation, when they no longer see these things as being one and the same. Now, I'm a big advocate of peaceful parenting. That's not really what this talk was about. I just found it paramount to point out this conflation, because when you keep this in mind, keep in mind what I've said here today about this conflation, the seeing of authority as being the entirety of security, social cooperation, and morality. When you keep that in mind, go talk to a statist. Like, you'll see, much of what they say is not coming from a place of reason. It's coming from a place of emotion. The emotional framework that we form as small children dictates how we think and feel for the rest of our lives. I mean, until you're old or dead, your formative years determine how you will think about things. So, it can be difficult to make that separation, but once you get it, once it clicks in a person and they no longer conflate those things, then you have somebody that can no longer be a tool for those who enslave us. They can no longer be a tool, or as Larkin was putting it, a collaborator. By the way, I think he puts on those seminars, and it's kind of a somewhat different topic, but it does boil in. He's got a lot of great pointers. If you ever get a chance, I would recommend going to one of those, absolutely. Those Candles in the Dark, him and Amanda do. But, even short of that, understand that when you're talking to a statist, it's not reason you're arguing against. You can't beat emotion with logic unless you happen to be dealing with a very intellectually honest person. So maneuver around their emotions. It sounds manipulative, but that's what you got to do. Show them that authority is antithetical to security. It's antithetical to social cooperation and morality. Did anybody have any questions or anything? I forgot what else I had to say.
Jake McCauley, ladies and gentlemen.
Sure. We can take a few questions if we want. Sure.
Anarchapulco, it's so hype, I'm trying to tell ya. This the event of the year and best vacation ever. Ron Potter, Jeffrey Tucker, just to name a few. Get your tickets, you don't wanna miss it. You should roll through. Talking politics to health and self-improvement to investing. So many things, not one thing. Learn how to live life unchained, yeah. 4 days vibing on the beach, time to connect. All about growth, way more than a conference. This is Anarchapulco, yeah. Let's go.
You ain't seen nothing yet.